Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second panel discussion as part of the Turing Dialogues on AI governance. So for those who were here in the last roundtable, we're pleased to have you back. And for those of you for whom it's the first time, welcome. Today, we will be discussing another important topic, the development of red lines for AI. So what are the boundaries that we have to establish and how? And to address this topic, we are joined and honored to have Dr. Gillian Hadfield, professor at Johns Hopkins University, Marc Rotenberg from the Center for AI and Digital Policy, and Tereza Zoumpalova from the Future Society. We'll let our speakers introduce themselves in a bit, but before that, I'll give the floor to Charbel and Charles to give the CeSIA's take on this topic. And Charbel, I give you the floor to start, please.
Thanks a lot, Ines. Thanks a lot. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Charbel-Segerie, Executive Director of the French Center for AI Safety, and I'm delighted to open this roundtable on what I believe is an increasingly urgent topic. How do we establish and enforce meaningful red lines in AI development? So last week, Microsoft announced an $80 billion investment in AI infrastructure for 2025. That's 40 times larger than Europe's latest AI factory initiative. And this scale of investment reflects the unprecedented acceleration we are witnessing in AI development. But it also raises critical questions about safety and control. So at CeSIA, we've been closely monitoring these developments, and what we are seeing is concerning. Our recent work has shown that evaluation methods are struggling to keep pace with AI capabilities. For instance, we are observing how simple prompt engineering techniques can dramatically improve model performance in cybersecurity tasks from 20% to 90% success rates, making it increasingly difficult to assess true system capabilities and risks. This is particularly worrying as we see the emergence of models that can reason in continuous latent space, potentially operating outside our ability to monitor them effectively. Meanwhile, open source development is accelerating faster than anticipated. Just look at DeepSeek R1, a new Chinese reasoning model that's already on par with OpenAI's latest offerings. 6 months ago, we published an op-ed with Yoshua Bengio highlighting the urgent need to define red lines in AI development. And today, as France prepares to host the AI Action Summit, we must move from principles to action. The consensus reached at Bletchley Park and reaffirmed in Seoul on catastrophic risks needs to be translated into concrete standards, particularly regarding computation thresholds that trigger monetary safety evaluation and critical capabilities like autonomous replication or AI research development that could pose catastrophic or even existential risks. We should include a broader set of voices in AI development beyond just private companies, since AI could significantly shape our society's future. We should have shared guidelines around safety, transparency, and testing, and red lines is a key tool in this regard. That's why I'm particularly pleased to welcome our distinguished speakers today. How do we translate these principles into actionable measures? How do we ensure effective implementation across different countries? And crucially, how do we move from consensus to concrete international coordination? Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Charbel. I will now give the floor to Charles.
Thank you very much, Ines. I'm very glad to be here. I'm Charles Martinet. I'm the head of policy at CeSIA, the French Center for AI Safety. And I'm really, really glad to have these wonderful panelists today. I'll keep this very brief. I just wanted to highlight in particular one point mentioned by Charbel, which is the potential and promise of international cooperation. So last year, or even more than 1 year ago now, in the United Kingdom, the EU and 30 countries, including China and the US, recognized the potential for serious harm from AI. Months later, in South Korea, many companies agreed to define what intolerable risk means in the context of AI. And now they're thinking about what those limits should be, what those intolerable risk means. And implementing red lines is one thing they can do. But there are many challenges in doing so. There's a challenge of definition. What red lines should we choose? There's a challenge of balancing innovation and safety, of keeping up with AI advancement. Those red lines must adapt and evolve. There's a challenge with coming to a global and most multi-stakeholder consensus. And finally, once those red lines are implemented, there's a challenge in enforcing and overseeing their implementation. So it's in this context and to discuss those issues that we're here today. And very importantly, the International AI Action Summit is coming in 2 weeks in Paris. And we believe it's a very important topic to discuss before the summit and after the summit and in the years to come. Thank you very much. Once again, really happy to have 3 wonderful panelists with us who have a lot of experience thinking and also dealing with those issues. Thanks. Over to you, Ines.
Thank you very much, Charles. So maybe to start quickly and before we start the conversation, I'll ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their views on the importance of red lines for AI. So Marc, over to you if you'd like to start.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marc Rotenberg. I'm the founder of the Center for AI and Digital Policy. We are a global network of AI policy experts and human rights advocates and have worked on red lines pretty much from the start. I also wanted to say I will be in Paris for the AI Action Summit and many of the related events and look forward to seeing people there.
Thank you very much, Marc. Now, Tereza, if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Ines. So my name is Tereza. I work for the Future Society, and I'll just say a few words about the organizations for those of you who aren't familiar with us yet. We're an independent nonprofit organization with a mission to align AI for better governance, and we just celebrated our 10th anniversary. So we've also been thinking about this for a while. We focus on general purpose AI models with potential capabilities to do everything from running chatbots to cyber attacks. And in order to ensure that the technology is safe and respects fundamental rights and values, we work on research, advocacy, and convenings. And specifically, I work within the Global AI Governance team, which focuses on advancing international dialogue and coordination. And red lines are one of our focus areas for this year. In the past months, I've been focusing specifically on working on topics related to the AI Action Summit, which you're of course all familiar with, given that we're here at a side event. And I worked on the summit's official consultation, which aimed to give a voice to civil society, academics, and citizens. So it gathered views of more than 10,000 citizens and over 200 organizations who were expressing their priorities for what the summit should achieve. And red lines were one of the ideas that emerged really frequently, which highlights the importance of them in this context. And that's why I'm really excited to be here with you today.
Thank you very much, Tereza. We'll definitely ask you about the output of the consultation a bit later on in the conversation. And now over to you, Dr. Hadfield.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gillian Hadfield. I am a professor in the New School of Government and Policy at Johns Hopkins University and also a member of the Computer Science Department here. I've been working in AI safety for about and governance for about 8 years. My original training is in economics and law, but I've now focused almost exclusively on thinking about AI. A number of things that I'm engaged in relevant to our conversation, my research agenda, which is partly supported by by Schmidt Sciences with an AI 2050, senior fellowship on building normative infrastructure for AI systems, and also a CFAR Canada AI chair at the Vector Institute. But perhaps most relevant to our conversation here, I'm a member of the group that's been holding international dialogues on AI safety. We issued a statement from our Beijing meeting last March about red lines. So I'm happy to talk more about that. And I'm also a founding member on the steering committee of the new International Association for Safe Ethical AI that is having their inaugural meeting next week in Paris. And I hope to see many of you there. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. So without further ado, we're gonna dive into our topic. So just to give a bit of an outline for this discussion, we'll first try to contextualize a little bit red lines and how they should, what they should be. And then we'll go more into maybe the different enforcement mechanisms and implementation concerns. So to begin, Tereza, you mentioned the stakeholder consultation. So you had experts, you had citizens give you feedback about what they thought should be the red lines. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And so what are, maybe to be more precise, what are consensus areas, what are disagreements that you have faced?
Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned, red lines were something that really kept reappearing amongst the consultation contributions, highlighting that many experts found this very important. In the citizens part, of course, it's less common to find it labeled like this, but you would still hear things such as, we want AI to not be developed if it would be dangerous for us, and things like that that would be related to the topic. In terms of the consensus on the expert side of the consultation, there was really broad consensus on establishing red lines in general and on them focusing on the most dangerous AI capabilities. So many of the respondents highlighted the need for severe risks to be addressed, especially where they might be of transnational or potentially catastrophic nature. So some of the repeatedly suggested red lines were related to autonomous replication, weapons development, cyber attacks, potential loss of control scenarios. And these were things that, in general, the participants agreed as something that could be part of red lines discussions. There was also consensus on applying tiered systems, so something similar to, let's say, the risk-based approach of the EU AI Act, where depending on the risk that we're looking at, we would, of course, be applying different rules. And there were also repeated mentions of the relevance of red lines for social impacts that are deemed unacceptable. But then here's where it started to diverge a bit with how that should be governed, because that depends more based on the countries, the political will, and the local context of what is deemed appropriate or not. So in some cases, there would be red lines on specific use cases, such as social scoring, predictive policing, things like that. But then in other jurisdictions, that might be allowed. There was a bit less agreement on that being something that should be harmonized internationally. In terms of the disagreement now, that was mainly on the specifics. So there wasn't a very clear consensus on exactly how the red lines should be defined and implemented. So a common taxonomy for that. Also on the metrics. So of course, it would be ideal if we could have quantifiable metrics that would help us draw those lines, but that's not so simple. So some respondents were mentioning things like compute thresholds, whilst others were pointing out to their limitations. And then the last thing that brought up some disagreement or different perspectives was the balance between safety and innovation, where some people would rather really make sure that we take safety as the first thing, even if that means we can develop some things. And others were a bit more thinking about how do we still develop them, but in a safer way. And maybe sometimes we should take the risk. So of course, that's a challenge that companies, governments, and civil society alike are all thinking about. But yeah, this is kind of the overall picture of red lines in the consultation.
Thank you very much for setting a bit the ground on the areas that we can start working on. Maybe in reaction to this and more broadly, Marc, which norms, for example, related to human rights and fundamental rights, can we and should we effectively translate into actionable red lines, and how?
So, Ines, thank you very much for the question. Before I answer it, if it's okay, I would like to take a moment just to fill in a little bit of background on this topic, because this is actually one of the areas of AI governance where there have been concrete developments in the last few years that I think will help inform our conversation. And I'd like to begin, for example, with a document that we had put together in 2018 called the Universal Guidelines for AI. This was endorsed by more than 300 AI experts in 40 countries and the ACM and IEEE and others. And you will see, if I can do this properly, our last guideline, which has actually become quite influential, is referred to as the termination obligation. And it says simply, an institution that has established an AI system has an affirmative obligation to terminate the system if human control of the system is no longer possible. And we actually see that as foundational to human-centric AI. And obviously it has informed a lot of the recent conversations about existential risk and safety. But I would also like to point, if I may, to a LinkedIn post I did in advance of our conversation today, where I wanted to summarize for people who would be interested in our conversation how this concept of red lines has evolved. So you see, we began in 2018 with the Universal Guidelines for AI. And then in 2021, UNESCO announces its recommendation on AI ethics. This is a document that was endorsed by 193 countries, and it set red lines for the use of AI for social scoring and mass surveillance. The following year, there's a decision from the Court of Justice of the European Union, which is the High Court, which basically said that opaque AI systems like black boxes could not be used for decisions that impact fundamental rights. In the US, we have the executive order on rights impacting and safety impacting AI systems in the federal government that failed to meet minimum practices should be decommissioned. And of course, perhaps most famously, the EU AI Act contains 8 explicit red lines on AI deployment. And it's actually very important when we talk about the AI Act. It's true, it's a risk-based framework, but the top tier of risk are the systems that are simply prohibited. And that is the current listing as of today. In fact, in the next week, these prohibitions go into force. So we can talk about that in the context of how we implement red lines. And I was also recently involved in the drafting of the Council of Europe AI Treaty, which is the first internationally binding treaty for AI governance. And that treaty says essentially at its core that we need to prohibit AI systems that fail to uphold human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So I wanted to provide for everyone these concrete examples of the red lines that have already been established, where there is already support from governments for these prohibitions. The 2 topics I did not get to is one, and I know this was suggested earlier, some of the boundaries based on compute and teraflops. We actually have that in a presidential executive order. I think it's 10 to the 26th and maybe 10 to the 23rd for biotech AI. So that's another dimension of red lines. And finally, of course, there's the use of AI systems in the military. And in a recent statement to a UN agency, my organization, the Center for AI and Digital Policy, along with others, urged red lines for AI systems for autonomous weapons systems, which I believe is also the view of the Secretary General of the UN. So there's, in brief, a quick overview, an inventory of red lines that have been established for AI.
Thank you very much for this overview. So we see that we already have a lot of presence, a lot of norms, maybe that are already dedicated to defining or starting to define these red lines. So maybe to react to this, Dr. Hadfield, could you, so from your perspective, working on AI alignment and governance through the lens of these human normative systems, that maybe some of their manifestation into institutions were just outlined by Marc, can you tell us how we can ensure that AI systems respect these normative systems when we define red lines?
So a bit like Marc, I actually would like to go back a step before addressing this question. Because the way I think about red lines is I think about them as trying to identify those points on which there is clear international consensus that we don't want a system like this one. And I sort of put in that category clear international consensus. We don't want systems that we've lost control over and that threaten really catastrophic effects on humans. So as we know, there's lots of dispute in the AI community about, do we face any risk at all that the systems could go out of control and, well, kill all humans, kill a lot of humans, do a lot of that kind of harm. There's a lot of disagreement about that. And the way I think about red lines, and so when we put together our statement out of our international dialogues, that's at least the way I was thinking about this, was from the point of view of what are the red lines that we are drawing not for AI systems. So there's a difference between drawing red lines and establishing what are the rules that AI systems have to follow. So your question here is about how do we make sure that the AI systems respect those lines. I think that's, broadly speaking, the regulation question about how, and particularly within different countries, within different communities, we say, we don't want it to do this. The EU says we don't want it to engage in social scoring. We don't want them to engage in emotion recognition. But not everybody globally is going to agree that that's something we want to prohibit, right? But that's the regulation question. For me, the red line question is really a question about what collectively on a global scale can we agree we do not want systems that pose this kind of risk. And that's why, and Tereza mentioned some of these points about, from the consultation. And in our Beijing statement, the 4 that we identified there: autonomous replication or improvement, undue efforts to acquire resources, power, and influence, the capacity to autonomously execute cyber attacks, and the capacity to deceive about capabilities to do these things. That's a smaller list than all the things we actually don't want AI to do, which is a much broader list. And Marc is identifying a lot of things from that list. There's obviously the EU AI, but there's also disagreement about this. So for me, a red line is actually not addressed to an AI system. A red line is addressed to the global community of governments and humans, basically, to say, can we agree that if we observe systems that were getting close to crossing this red line, we actually need a regime change in how we approach our regulatory challenge? Because we need that. This is why, again, Marc, I hadn't seen this before, but I like this, the termination obligation that says, can we get global agreement that we need to actually stop systems that have this kind of capacity? So it's a different kind of question than the one you got here, Ines, that about it's really not addressed to AI systems. For me, the red lines are addressed to the international community. And when we're thinking about what kinds of red lines should we draw, we're thinking about, would we have global agreement that we're in a crisis, that we have systems that are imminently capable of being so out of control that they can replicate themselves, they can improve themselves, they can execute cyber attacks, they have the capacity autonomously to interfere so extensively. We don't have to agree on the likelihood that that can happen. We know that I just was listening to a conversation from Davos between Yoshua Bengio and Andrew Ng, and they have very different views about the likelihood this could ever happen. I'd like to focus on red lines that say you don't have to agree this is likely to happen, but could you agree that if this was happening, we should be doing something very different globally on the regulatory front? And I kind of want to separate that out from the regulatory challenge here of making sure that AI systems are following our rules, which, as you note, is sort of the bulk of the research that I do about how do you make sure your systems follow the rules we set for them. I don't want to regulate systems that are beyond our red lines. I want to shut them down.
Thank you so much. Yes, but maybe that's the whole challenge, is to have a global consensus on not just what we don't want the systems to do, but when do we consider that these systems are doing the thing we don't want them to do, and how we can control that.
Yes. Yeah, I can address that question if you want me to continue, because this is where I think what we need to be focused on globally are the kinds of monitoring and registration systems that would give us the capacity to know if we were getting close to those red lines. The proposals that I've put forward with Tino Cuellar and Tim O'Reilly for the registration of frontier models, for example, which is actually what partly ended up in the now rescinded Biden executive order, the one that Marc referenced, that set some limits, is that if you're building a system, training a system above a certain size, you need to notify the government. I think we need global systems that are tracking what is out there. And we don't have anything like that right now. So as a starting point, I think we need the infrastructure, and then we need international organizations that, we need to figure out how to build. And that's what our international dialogues are trying to work through. There's it's mostly academics, but Chinese academics, others from around the globe, to say, how can we get some consensus and work towards a body that would be capable and we would trust to be keeping some eyes on about what's being built, so we know if we need to act. I never want to try and convince somebody about the probability of things going, losing control. I don't know what that probability is. I don't know that attaching a number to it makes any difference. But I really worry about the fact that we don't have that visibility. And we need to have established kind of like that early warning system that says, we didn't expect it, but, fire has happened and we need to start behaving differently.
Thank you very much. I see that Marc wants to react, and maybe Marc, in your reaction, could you talk also a little bit about how your work with the Council of Europe Treaty on AI maybe bring some answers and solutions to this? You're muted, Marc.
I can see that's an AI training model trying to silence me. But I did want to applaud Gillian for her excellent comments. I think this issue of oversight is actually essential right now. I distinguish between consensus and enforcement. My view is actually today there is a high degree of consensus on where to draw many red lines. Maybe not all, maybe we haven't figured them all out. But I think the consensus that currently exists, particularly in the AI Act of the European Union, is striking. But the question of enforcement is enormous. And I think we do need to walk down that road a little bit to understand how we are going to make this all work. One of the conclusions I've come to is that independent oversight is essential to enforcement of red lines. And I think we have to break out of this belief that self-regulatory models or competition or notice alone will be sufficient to ensure that prohibitions are maintained. And this is also why, if you look at the AI Act, the role of the supervisory authorities is so critical. Now, what the U.S. has done, and although correctly there's been I'm not sure if it is technically a rescinding. We still don't know what the Trump administration is going to do on AI policy, but I'm actually hoping that a lot of what was previously established in the U.S. will be carried forward because a lot of it's very sensible. And the creation of the Safety Institute and the independent monitoring of risk is absolutely vital. So this is, as I said, I think it's key to seeing the difference between consensus and enforcement and recognizing the role of independent oversight. And to your question, Ines, we're very happy about the outcome of the Council of Europe AI treaty. There are, including the EU states, now I think 38 countries that have endorsed the treaty. Those are signatures. We still need ratification. I believe there will be more announcements during the AI Action Summit in Paris, which we're looking forward to. But in the context of the AI treaty, we also need to monitor the oversight mechanisms, because this is not a treaty like much of law. It's not self-executing. It requires institutions and people with expertise and political will to ensure that the principles that are established will be upheld. But we've made progress, and I'm very enthusiastic about this.
Thank you very much. Maybe I will move on to Tereza to ask her about the more compliance mechanisms, perhaps, if we move on to the enforcement side, that we've been talking a lot about the consensus, about the red lines, but if we were to enforce, so we saw that we have initiatives, but so what could be governance frameworks that could work across different jurisdictions and enable this enforcement? If you have any examples, feel free.
Yeah, so I think some of this might be more on a broader level of things to think about as we design those. So the first thing would be, you mentioned across different jurisdictions, and that makes me think that the first thing to consider is international cooperation here, of course, because that means that we should ideally define the red lines in a harmonized way and have as much international agreement as possible so that we can then enforce them across jurisdictions. And this can be anything from work through international dialogues such as at the AI Action Summit, but also different pathways like the Track 2 dialogues that have been mentioned before. It could also be discussions through international working groups on standards or information sharing systems. So any effort to internationally try and define these thresholds would probably already then make compliance and enforcement across jurisdictions easier. Then the other part, if we define them, is like ensuring that we don't cross the red lines and knowing that we do. So that would largely be through testing and evaluation, both pre and post deployment, risk assessments, ideally requiring both internal evaluations, but also third-party evaluations. And we could be thinking about a variety of things from evaluations by ACs or independent auditors. And this all could hopefully contribute to more transparency, more reporting, and that way we could track also whether developers are following voluntary commitments or hopefully red lines that would actually be enforced by law. In terms of enforcement mechanisms, if this is not happening, there could be a wide range that was also referred to by some of the participants in the consultation, from financial penalties, legal mechanisms like injunctive action, restrictions for serious violations, limitation to access different markets, or potentially even hardware-enabled governance mechanisms to prevent those systems from further use, although that might be difficult in practice. And then one other thing that I wanted to point out here, which is tangentially related to it as well, is whistleblower protection, where maybe in some cases, if we wouldn't be able to necessarily pick up everything in evaluations or in audits that would be coming from the outside, or maybe the internal ones wouldn't in some cases necessarily show us everything in advance. It could be that in some cases, there could be someone inside of those labs noticing something where maybe it hasn't yet crossed our red lines, but they might notice that it is approaching something that could become dangerous. And for those people to know that they are protected and there's an international system also for them to be able to report such cases would be quite important as well. So maybe that's the last point that I had in mind in terms of some things that could help with compliance with these red lines.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think it maybe goes back also a little bit to what Dr. Hadfield was saying about being able to monitor what is happening, and we talked about what the red lines mean concretely in practice. So maybe us having people from the inside having the right mechanism to be able to assist this monitoring and help us have the clearest view possible on how close we are from crossing the line can be a very good enforcement mechanism. And maybe just to build on what you were saying a little bit, you mentioned the AI Summit. So what do you think could be some opportunities or challenges with the upcoming summit to contribute in establishing these global red lines?
Well, I guess in general, the summit can be an incredible opportunity, although of course we need to be realistic with how much can be achieved in 2 days and how much consensus can be achieved. But in general, this can help build international consensus, promote collaboration, mobilize resources, establish different bodies. But more specifically, from a few deliverables that were mentioned also by participants in the consultation, here I'm drawing mostly from from the broad consensus from the consultation, but the details often come from a few that were very detailed on this. We had some from Concordia AI, FLI, Safer AI, UC Berkeley, and Center for Future Generations, as well as many others contributing. And some of the ideas that were mentioned of what the summit specifically could achieve here were things ranging from defining practical risk thresholds and doing that in a multi-stakeholder way. So including experts from industry, from academia, from civil society. This is something that this summit actually seems to be trying to do, with really involving civil society more than has been the case for previous summits. So hopefully that could be something that could be advanced here. The summit could also help develop assessment methodologies, focusing on some measurable metrics, creating some implementation guidelines related to what we were just discussing, potentially establishing voluntary monitoring systems, or publishing a report with some clear thresholds and industry-ready monitoring approaches, or even just highlighting the previous work done in a concise manner and then facilitating further dialogues on it. But that's to focus more specifically on the red lines. But one thing that I wanted to mention as well was that the most frequently raised priority in the consultation was auditing. And that's something that would contribute to our goal here as well, because as we discussed, in order for monitoring what's happening with these systems and if they would potentially be crossing any red lines or approaching any thresholds that we have, auditing them and having third-party independent auditors as well would be very important. And we're really hoping and seeing signs of that being something that the summit will address in terms of strengthening the auditing ecosystem. So yeah, of course, there are challenges in terms of political hurdles, interoperability of the different systems, and just the agreement and the timeline of the summit being a 2-day thing. So I guess let's not expect miracles, but I think there is great potential for a lot of things that could support this.
Thank you so much for these insights. We have talked about, yes, I mean, there seems to be a lot of thoughts about the tools that we can use and the different mechanisms that we can use to have these evaluations and to apply. But then there's maybe a different side to the enforcement, which is what do we do if we cross the line or after we cross the line? And so my next question will be addressed to Gillian Hadfield. So what can we learn from human societies that historically developed and enforced norms when we think about red lines for AI?
Well, again, I really want to emphasize that red lines are red lines for the international community to say, these are lines we should draw for ourselves, where we have agreed that if we see risk of crossing them, that we, it's all hands on deck, to say something very dangerous. So the kinds of models that you want to think about are things like nuclear weapons, and chemical weapons, and sort of global agreements on lines we draw about how we conduct war and competition. I think that the kinds of lessons that from the more general thinking about how human normative systems work, which is what most of my research is about, has to do with saying, like one of the key things we need are systems where there's, we need to be working for broad agreement. We need the voluntary participation of a lot of diverse peoples and governments if we really are talking about, the potential for existential risk. And again, part of what you have to do is realize there's a lot of people who don't think that that's the path we're on. And Tereza mentioned from the consultations, concerns about innovation. We're seeing, some very strong messaging about that from the US government at this point. And I think, it's very clear. I think Charles or Charbel mentioned the DeepSeek and sort of like the way the world is just changing so rapidly in this domain, and it's very competitive in a race. We need to be thinking about the broadest capacity for identifying where there can be consensus across a highly diverse group of people, because the key thing about establishing normative systems is you need that voluntary participation from your key players. There are things that are helpful there. Clarity. So like everybody, you can be critical about the flops and training limits in the original Biden executive order. I would probably have not done it in terms of flops, but I would, in terms of parameter, everybody knows it should really be in terms of capacity. But that's a very difficult thing to write law about, and that's a very difficult thing to get agreements about. Whereas, we can talk about lines that are clearer to see when they've been crossed. So a key feature of a red line is it needs to be quite clear and very low disagreement potential about when it's been crossed. And you have to think of go back to the voluntary point. You have to think about the payoffs to all the players that you need to participate in this. It needs to be something that they see as in their interest. So we need to think about, well, how do you ensure that you've established a system that creates those interests and doesn't reinforce, perceived vulnerabilities or inequality? So these are some of the lessons I think we might take from, the design of stable normative systems in working with red lines.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned I think the voluntary aspect maybe is perhaps the only thing that can make an enforcement efficient.
Yeah, it's very important to remember when we talk about enforcement, and and it's got to be global, right? Because it needs to be global. It's an entirely voluntary system. There's no global enforcer, no global police force. It needs to be something that, in a continuous, stable way, lots of diverse players globally see it in their interest in participating in supporting the solution.
Completely. Thank you so much for these insights. So my last question before we open the Q&A will be addressed to Marc. In light of everything that has been said, how do you think institutions like the AI Safety Institutes, for example, or others that you've presented at the beginning of this conversation, can foster this consensus, maybe this and bring people who are stakeholders in matters of establishing red lines to agree on what Dr. Hadfield just mentioned? From your experience, how do you think that can take place? What are perhaps the things we should be optimistic about? when it comes to, yes, to fostering consensus through these international institutions and through the dialogues that are ongoing. Sorry, you're muted.
Again, the AI training model is after me. There has been remarkable progress in AI governance in a very short period of time. It's not been reported as widely, let's say, as the newest iteration of ChatGPT. But for those of us who do follow AI governance, it is reassuring, I would say, that governments have responded as quickly as they have, and also for the most part in a coordinated fashion. I do believe that consensus has been established across many applications, and the key now will be enforcement. I wanted to mention, a very important outcome of the UN's AI Summit and the Global Digital Compact was the recommendation to establish a scientific panel on AI, similar to the International Panel on Climate Change. And the reason for doing this is to provide evidence-based assessment of AI system capability with broad participation by governments around the world, and to make these findings widely available, publicly available. So that scientific panel should also be part of our thinking as we consider next steps. Another important phrase we need to use more frequently is impact assessment. Because you see, it isn't the case with an AI system, like an engine boiling over, for example, that you suddenly go, oh my gosh, we've passed the red line and now we're in trouble. The development, deployment, and perhaps decommissioning of an AI system requires impact assessments that are constantly reviewed and revised as capabilities change. And this is key, of course, to maintaining human control. And it's, a standard feature of most of modern industrial production, whether it's in transportation or medical devices or food safety. This is quite familiar to people in industry. I think we need to bring this thinking to the AI world. It's certainly the case that when a new AI service comes out, we're quite interested. I mean, I was reading the technical description of DeepSeek, just like I read the technical description of ChatGPT when it first came out. It was almost 2 years ago, actually November 2022, when OpenAI released ChatGPT. And I'm reading through the system card, and OpenAI itself had identified almost a dozen risks to public safety, including cybersecurity and material relating to children. So we went to the Federal Trade Commission and said to the U.S. Consumer Protection Agency, you really need to open an investigation, which they did. So going forward, thinking about red lines, the institutions are being established. We need to monitor them, and we need to ensure that they fulfill their mandate. I think that's the best way we maintain human-centric AI.
Thank you very much for your answer, and thank you to the three of you for all your insights. We'll move on to the Q&A, so I will take some questions from the chat. Maybe the first from Salvi and Gillian. What role should companies play in enforcing AI red lines? Is self-regulation effective, or do we need stronger external oversight? So who would like to take the question?
Well, I believe in stronger external oversight, particularly in the United States. I think the EU has done a good job producing an important framework. I think that framework is likely to have global impact. There's a policy dynamic sometimes described as the Brussels effect, which we had with the EU Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, and I think it's anticipated with the AI Act. But it does presume strong independent oversight and companies that are willing to follow their compliance obligations. We will get into trouble if companies say, well, we really don't think we have to do what they're telling us to do. I hope that doesn't happen.
I hope so
Maybe
too.
I could
Yes.
Maybe I could jump in with a little bit of thinking here again. I want to distinguish between the red lines where we're saying we've crossed into a regime where we think that there's serious loss of control of systems that are autonomously self-replicating, executing autonomous goals without human intervention and oversight. And at that point, it's about shutting that down. It's not about getting them back, to behave better or punishing them in some way. I think those are questions for governments to establish that those limits exist and such systems are not allowed. And as I say, if you focus on that global consensus that this is really something where nobody can say, oh, but let's let that run a little further because it's good for innovation. We haven't drawn the red line in the right place, and people are making that argument. Then the role for the tech companies is that, at least currently in the world we're in now, at least in the West, we have very little government visibility into what's being built and its capabilities. I think this is, I keep saying, is probably the first time in history. So there has to be a very important role for technology companies to be monitoring for when we are when they're developing systems that get close. Mark had mentioned some of the disclosures from OpenAI with ChatGPT. So when you're thinking about those voluntary participants in the enforcement system, and the enforcement system fundamentally rests on information and visibility of what's happening. So I think that's a key role we have to think about for the tech companies.
Thank you for these answers. So just because we're running out of time, I will ask another question from Mathieu. That says, one widely discussed potential red line is self-replication and adaptation. If we cross this red line, what policies can we implement?
Well, my quick answer is that if we reach that point, it's too late. And this is frankly why I find the discussion over AGI, or what we used to call the singularity, very frustrating. People are saying, well, are we going to get to AGI, or the current models, won't take us to AGI? And I'm sure from a scientific perspective, it's an important question. But from a governance perspective, it's actually the wrong question. Because from a governance perspective, you need to assume models that maintain and governance structures that maintain human control over the devices that humans create, which means that we need to get busy now putting in place those governance structures so that whatever form AI takes, we still maintain responsibility for what we create. And what worries me about the AGI conversation is that I know some of the people in this world are actually looking forward to turning over a lot of decisions that people make to machines. I think that would be a tragic mistake, and I think we need to get away from that thinking.
So that's actually very interesting, but maybe in reaction to this, Gillian, you mentioned earlier that we see red lines more clearly after they are crossed, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but so how do we make sure to all know what we're talking about when we're saying, if the red line is crossed, it's too late, but to make sure it doesn't get crossed, we have to clearly define it, and then identifying what it would look like. Here, for example, a replication or AGI. So it seems like there's a lot of discussions about what that can mean, what it could look like, but not really a consensus. Do you think that we should maybe address this fact, this lack of definition, perhaps?
Yeah, so let's distinguish between establishing a red line that says if a system can, and maybe one also wants to say, and will engage in autonomous self-replication and improvement, which is to say, you go home at night and the system is continuing to work on and developing and building out its programs, advancing its training, and building systems, going on the internet, building other structures. We were already looking at the use of AI systems to engage in AI research and development, right? That's still under the oversight of human researchers. But if you, I think you can articulate that is a red line, right? Now, the hard part is, how would we know if we're getting close? Yes, if you've crossed it already, like the cat's out of the bag. So what you need to do is say, okay, how would we know if we were seeing that capability and that that potential, that likelihood? And that's where I say this is the incredible challenge we're facing, is we don't know very much at all about how these systems work. Even the people who are building them don't know a lot about. We don't have established methodologies to evaluate. What we call evaluations right now are just kind of spot checks. Oh, let's see if I can get the system to do this, right? There's no systematic science here, either about how they function or how to evaluate them. And there are inherently real challenges in doing that scientifically. But that's why I say, okay, number one is we need more visibility into systems, because we need more people than the people who are building it. And I got lots of faith in the people who are building them, by the way. I'm not cynical about that. I mean, I'm an economist. They're operating in a profit-making organization. They're going to have various pressures on them. But we just need a lot more people studying, looking at this, having visibility into it. We need to build government capacity and expertise in this. And step one there is gaining increased visibility. We do not know how to evaluate right now to say here's how close we are to that autonomous self-replication. And that needs to be job one right now. But I don't think it's a challenge of where to draw the red line. Here's a capacity we don't want. Capacity and likelihood of executing cyber attacks autonomously. Right? I think I can articulate that. I think we could get there. But how do I evaluate whether or not a system is getting close to that? That's where we need to focus our efforts, I think.
Thank you very much. And before we conclude, maybe very briefly, I don't know if Tereza, you wanted to react on that with regards to the evaluations in particular that you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, I think with the evaluations, of course, many of the problems have been raised with it now as well, that even the ones that are around are for now still just, in a way, I'm of course simplifying, but like trying around a few things and hoping to get some result. But even if we don't see a dangerous capability, it doesn't mean that it's not there, right? It means that we didn't see it, but it doesn't necessarily exclude the possibility of there being something that we haven't seen. So I think that's where also the perspective from self-regulation, voluntary commitments, and really enforcement from the inside would, in the ideal world, be really important, because we would hope that there could be more done from the inside than from the outside. But of course, that is more challenging with different incentives, as well as with sometimes these properties emerging unexpectedly, right? Like as was mentioned, it wasn't probably, while there are people with the intention of building AGI, hopefully still their intention is not, let's build something really dangerous that can create horrible harms. Still, that's presumably not anyone's intention, but we can get there without realizing that that's where we're headed. So anyways, that's a bit of a broad reaction, but I think it's just some reflections on some of the challenges that we've been discussing as well.
Thank you very much. So I think we could go on for maybe another 2 days discussing just this topic, but unfortunately we're out of time. So if anyone participating is interested in finding out more about evaluations, we actually had a bit of a deep dive 2 weeks ago about this topic, and the video is available on YouTube. And I would just like to take 30 seconds to thank you so much. Thank you, Gillian, Marc, and Tereza, for coming, for sharing your insights. You've given us a lot of food for thought. And I hope that, the upcoming AI Summit, we mentioned it briefly, but we'll take into consideration all these challenges, but also the opportunities to define clear red lines and have more action and enforcement with this regard. And thank you to all the participants who joined. Thank you for engaging, for your questions. And I would also like to send a particular shout out and thanks to Emma Gounet and Clément Forestlou, who are volunteers who also contributed with their time and their talent to make these roundtables happen. So thank you so much. And stay tuned, everyone, for the upcoming events. Thank you.